In today's podcast, we are joined by Les Stroud, and we enjoy a deep conversation about the relationship between humans and nature, with a focus on helping children and their parents access powerful experiences in wild places.
Look for me in the mountains, where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Welcome to the Backpacking Light Podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking to somebody that I think I can safely describe as one of my childhood heroes, Les Stroud, otherwise known as the Survivorman. And Ryan, they say don't ever meet your heroes, but I have to say I was not disappointed by this chat.
It was a delightfully surprising conversation.
Yeah, I can't wait for you guys to hear it. But before we get to that, let's spend some time catching up and talk about our new favorite things. So, Ryan, what's new with you?
I went on an overnighter this last weekend in sub-zero temperatures with as little gear as possible. I was really trying to focus on simplicity and minimalism, so I just took a bivy sack, very little gear, and had just a riotous time in the Wyoming backcountry. And I skied in and experienced a wide variety of terrain, from unconsolidated deep snow where my skis just sank several feet into the snow, and places up high on ridges that I had to cross where I had to take my skis off and walk on bare rock. So it was a wild time and a great refresher.
Now, were you using trekking skis or like a backcountry downhill setup or cross-country skis of some type?
Yeah, I was using a Nordic BC Triple N setup. So I have, with temperatures that cold, you can't really use a day ski setup. So I was using the Alaska insulated leather boots with a BC Triple N max binding, and those are mounted onto some fairly wide matcha skis that have a fish scale bottom, but I had to use kicker skins for the steeper terrain for sure, and even the kicker skins weren't enough for the mountains that I was in.
Well, I've been using a Whoop strap lately, the last month or two, to collect data, and right before I got that, I used the free version of Training Peaks for a week, like the free premium membership, so you have access to all the stuff. And so that gave me a pretty unique opportunity to compare those two platforms back to back. So I've gathered some interesting observations based on that.
Yeah, tell me about it. What are you learning?
Well, I think ultimately Training Peaks is a super powerful tool, and it's slightly cheaper than Whoop. But it's not a piece of hardware. It's a piece of software that's requiring you to collect data, through other ways. So if you already have a fitness tracker of some type, you can use that. But as you probably know, wrist-based fitness trackers aren't super accurate in terms of heart rate and things like that. And so what I struggled with Training Peaks was making sure that the data I was inputting was accurate. That was one thing. And then the second thing I had trouble with is just, it's such a powerful tool that it was a little overwhelming to me. It was too much for what I needed. Whoop, on the other hand, is more expensive by about $20 a month. It is a piece of hardware, but because it's not a watch, it has more sophisticated tracking tools. The sleep tracking is way more sophisticated. The heart rate's way more sophisticated. And I find the interface just enough to meet my needs.
I'm a Training Peaks power user, and the thing I really miss about it is that when I have to actually measure stress in terms of heart rate variability, it's a manual measurement I have to do every morning, and then input that into my Training Peaks software, which is a pain. So that's one thing I really like about Whoop. The other thing is sleep tracking. I think it's a really powerful way to monitor trends, training, and recovery. And Training Peaks, again, that's kind of a manual thing. And my Garmin watch can do that, but it's not as nice as the Whoop interface. I'm really looking closely at it too.
Yeah, I do a lot of interesting comparison between what my Garmin Phoenix is measuring sleep-wise and what my Whoop is measuring sleep-wise, and it's really instructive.
Yeah, I bet the Whoop is more sophisticated as a sleep tracker.
Yeah, for sure. With the Garmin, if you just sit quietly at bedtime and read, it will often think you're asleep, and Whoop is not fooled by
That's
that at
right.
all.
Yeah. What are you learning from using Whoop, and how is it changing your behavior?
One of my favorite features with Whoop is that it has a daily journal. And when you wake up in the morning, you can input behaviors and activities from the day before. What time your last meal was. What time, if you ate a vegetarian diet or not. If you meditated or not. You can actually go through and put what you'd like to track. It has a whole range of things. And I found that I immediately started cutting back on my alcohol intake and started seeing better results recovery-wise. But then I spent a couple of weeks not imbibing any alcohol at all, and then went back to having maybe 1 or 2 drinks every other day or so. And then Whoop started telling me that when I did that behavior, I was recovering better.
Wow.
So it actually helped me find like a sweet spot between like being a hardcore super trainer, I'm not going to just do a beer, at all.
Right, right.
Yeah, so for whatever reason, I'm recovering better, with a glass of wine or a beer at the end of the day. So
Interesting. So now you got to correlate it to the type of alcohol and the brand that you're drinking.
there you go. Yeah, but that would require me to go in and keep track of stuff that Whoop isn't, which I'm not going to do. So
The thing that I find really interesting, and I have a friend of mine who uses it as well, and during the election cycle last fall, he really paid attention to the activities he did before going to bed, and he's a news junkie. And he got so stressed out that he eventually had to kind of take a fast from the news post-election. And so when he did that, and he like stopped consuming news before dinner and then did other activities like reading and meditation in the evenings, and Whoop was able to correlate sleep habits and recovery stress pretty significantly as a result of this one dramatic change. And for him, he said, I'll never go back to reading news at night.
yeah, it's a powerful tool.
Yeah.
Well, what other gear are you looking at right now?
Well, I got the Jetboil Stash, and as you know, this little launch that Jetboil had last month came with a lot of fanfare, a lot of bloggers promoting it, and now that I have it in hand and have had the chance to burn it a few times and take it outside, I guess I'm not as enamored as everybody else.
Okay.
And, we've been discussing this in the forums. There is a forum related to it. And the great thing about this system is that it is a small, compact, self-contained system with a heat exchanger pot. It is not an integrated canister stove system where the pot securely attaches to the stove like a traditional Jetboil or an MSR wind burner. So it's a standalone Jetboil stove. The pot is fantastic. Unfortunately, the stove is the weak point because it's the traditional Jetboil burner. It's very sensitive to wind. And I just don't think you're going to get you're not going to be able to eke the performance out of this in cold, windy weather like you would with something with a fully protected burner like the MSR wind burner.
Yeah. About a year ago, I started pairing a standalone titanium pot, but it had baffles built into the bottom of it. I started pairing that with my MSR Pocket Rocket Deluxe.
Yeah.
And that is a super potent
Yeah.
combination. I mean, I extend my fuel use by a noticeable amount using that combination.
Roger Caffin did an article on, is a heat exchanger pot worth it? We should put that in the show notes. What kind of pot are you using with the Pocket
I think
Rocket?
it's a Mons Peak.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, and it just has some baffles built into the bottom of it and a little I don't know, depression or dip in the baffles, where the flame can come in.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Good. Yeah. I think if MSR wants to create a system like this around their pocket rocket, they would hit it out of the park.
Yep, I agree. Well, I've been testing alpaca wool in the last month, and I know you've been doing this a little bit too, but I've mostly been looking at products from a company called Appalachian Gear Company.
Yeah.
And they've got a sweater that is kind of like taking off right now amongst some members of the community, and I'm also testing their beanie and one of their neck gaiters. And the people who are making alpaca products are making a lot of claims right now about warmth for weight and performance and things like that. And so what I'd like to do is really put some of those claims to the test. So I'm going to send the sweater to our resident expert in these matters, Steven Sieber, and see if he can do some heat mapping experiments with it. But in terms of just anecdotal, subjective stuff, I've noticed it's a very light fabric. It holds odor even less than merino, I think. But it is a little itchy, I think.
Yeah. Fibers, is it because the fibers are higher diameter or different structure? Do you know?
I do not know that. I do not know that. I can tell you that at least the nature of the fabric, there seems to be a lot more stray fibers kind of sticking out from the fabric than with your general like tightly woven merino stuff.
Sure. Interesting. I'm curious to see what long-term impacts it'll have on your clothing system.
Yeah. The other thing is, I mentioned in the last podcast episode that I was going to start looking at Innovate's Terra Ultra G270 for my 3-season use, backpacking and trail running this summer. I got those in the mail. They are very impressive. Very impressive.
So what's the singular feature that just blows you away when you look at them?
I wasn't expecting to say this, but I think comfort. They just fit so well. They just seem to be really, really well engineered and well designed. Like I can get the fit dialed in tightly, but it's not so tight that it like causes pressure and weird stuff. And that is a surprisingly hard thing to do, I found, with trail runners, is to get the fit like just perfect.
I've had great success with Innovate shoes. I'm super excited to try these as well. All right, let's move on to our interview. So our guest today is Les Stroud, best known for his television persona as the Survivorman. Les is a musician, filmmaker, author, and teacher with a mission to connect people to nature. We're going to chat with Les about his new children's book, Wild Outside, as well as explore deeper concepts about the relationship between humans and nature. Here's the interview. All right, Les, welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
You had a powerful transformation moment in the woods in your young adulthood, a canoe trip that essentially changed the course of your life. Can you tell us about that experience and what happened during that trip that motivated you to come home and pivot from a career as a musician to a career as an outdoorsman?
Yeah, that was, I think that it's wonderful if you are introduced to outdoor adventure when you're young. That was not my case. I grew up in an era and a place and time and a family that I didn't have access to any of that. My only adventure was watching Jacques Cousteau and Tarzan movies. And then eventually we had a cottage we could go to. And I would play out back of the cottage. So when fast forward to my mid-20s after, 10 years of wanting to be a rock star, basically. And it's not that I didn't do well in that field, and I had a little bit of an oyster in front of me, but nonetheless, I didn't have the mentorship or the guidance, so I was also disillusioned, and so I decided to pull out. But right around that time when I decided to pull away from music, it's like, well, what can I do? And I just so happened, coincidentally, I guess, if you will, I was invited to go on a canoe trip with about 8 people to Temagami, Ontario. Now, the thing is, when you're a late starter and you're not brought up in a family who adventures and you're not brought up in that ambiance of outdoor adventure and excitement, and then your gear sucks. So you don't have anything. You don't even know. So I showed up in Greb Kodiak construction boots, steel-toed, from my job, track pants, a bomber jacket from high school, and an old yellow, raincoat from Canadian Tire, which is a store up in Canada that also sells, hardware. But once we got to Temagami, and we got out in the woods, and this is my first trip. Now, fortunately, the people leading the trip, like the guy Ziggy Kiesling, he knew what he was doing. He guided kids camps and kids trips, and also people at risk. He took individuals at risk of going to jail. He did that kind of tripping as well. So he knew what he was doing. So that was great. I was in good hands. But the bottom line is the epiphany was that even though I was as described, I might as well have been in the middle of the Amazon jungle. I might as well have been on a mountain in the Himalayas, because it felt like the greatest adventure I'd ever experienced in my life. And since that day I've paddled. I lived in Temagami, but and that's something I think that's really key. Even with and I know we're going to chat about my new book, but the same thing I try to point out a lot is that adventure's right in your backyard as well. And this high-end adventure? Some might think so, but not compared to many other things that could happen. It was a canoe trip in Northern Ontario, 4 hours from my home. But it was everything to me, and it changed my world entirely, because I just simply thought, I could do a lot of this, and I want to do a lot of this.
That's fantastic. Is there any moment on that trip you look back at now that you want young people to experience? Something that you experienced in the wilderness there that you would like a young person to experience today?
I think part of it, I'll premise this by saying this might seem out of place for me and a guy like me and what I've done to be saying, but I actually don't like to be alone in the wilderness. I like to be alone on a hike or something there, take my dogs, but I like to be in the wilderness and share it with people. That's all. I've done lots of alone trips before becoming Survivorman, and I was always lonely. And then Survivorman, I was lonely. Lonely's terrible out there. So what I think was amazing about that trip was the sense of camaraderie. I barely knew most of the people on the trip. And you discover... Sure, we have personalities that can be annoying and grating, and they can come out on canoe trips and hiking trips and things like that. But on the other hand, there seems to be something very galvanizing about being out on an adventure, something that pulls you together. You realize that if there's 4 of you or 14 of you, you're all sort of doing the same thing, going after the same ideal, this adventure, this next view, this experience with that pine marten or that hawk. And so that was something that was very heartwarming for me, to experience camaraderie with individuals I didn't really know that well. And I would say it was because of nature. It was because of being in nature and the healing process of just being in nature. I think it does that to us. And so for younger people getting into adventures, it's to understand that that's possible. If you have a background or a neighborhood or a school experience that's not so pleasant. I'm not going to suggest that there can't be unpleasant experiences, sociologically speaking, in the wilderness, but I'm going to say they're fewer and farther between for sure. I think for the most part, you end up having a lot of wonderful, wonderful experiences. And when I became a professional guide, I was a guide for 15 years. I mean, it was nothing but that over and over and over again. Absolute strangers that you got along great with. It was, there was the odd annoying character along the way, but that's a small percentage of the annoying characters in high school were everywhere. The annoying characters on a canoe trip or a hiking or backpacking trip it's very rare that happens.
Mm-hmm. Les, after everything you've done in your career, why a book for young people, and why right now?
Well, so we're talking about Wild Outside. There's my shameless plug. Get that plug in. Not so shameless, because that's what we're talking about, but if you take a look at my work as Survivorman or Beyond Survival or Shark Week or Survivorman Bigfoot, I have just tons and tons of kid fans. Kids have been digging Survivorman since I first started. I've got photographs of kids who dressed up as Survivorman for Halloween. And if that isn't, endorsement, I don't know what is, right? So, and I've always known that even though I may have directed my work towards adults and towards people in your age group, for example, that's great, but I also knew that there's just no way. I remember loving this stuff because of my days of watching Jacques Cousteau and Tarzan, and there's no way that kids aren't going to love what I'm putting out here, and sure enough, they did. So Wild Outside gives me the opportunity now, instead of writing a book that is for teachers and outdoor educators and in that sort of like, and here's the next thing you can do, instead I'll write it straight to the kids. They've been enjoying my work anyway, so it was my chance to speak directly to that age group and speak. And I had to learn too through my publisher. They were phenomenal in this, Anik Press, to learn how to, am I using language that's above their heads? Am I using language that's beneath them? I need to get in the zone there. There was my opportunity to do that. So it was definitely not like a new thing for me to do. I mean, I guided thousands of kids on hundreds of trips. So, all of them teenagers and younger and from ages, 7 on up through to adults, of course. So it wasn't actually anything new for me to do. More than anything, it's about time.
How did you go about deciding which of your adventures to include in your book? Were you looking for anything specific?
Yes, but I started by first just picking the adventures, right? I've got lots, so that's great. Lots to choose from. But then I had to look at, okay, but what do they teach? What are the lessons in this particular story? So working with Anik and Claire Caldwell at Anik Press was phenomenal, because I'm a big fan of, if you're working with people who really know what they're doing in this thing you're about to do, trust them, because I don't need to be a control freak. If you were asking me to work with you on directing a documentary film, I'll be a control freak. But when it comes to writing a children's book, naturally I needed some guidance and help with the best. So Anik Press worked with me, and we looked at the stories themselves, and then we came up with this idea that, well, if we base it on say 4 concepts like preparing and adapting and reacting, observing, then okay, so then let's look at the stories I have. Oh, this story over here about this bear, it doesn't really fit. It's a great story, but the lesson is outside of those 4 concepts, or it's too much of a stretch. But this story over here about bumping into the lynx, or being chased up a tree by a moose, or becoming hypothermic in Norway, well, I can use them for this one fits really well in the preparation. So I did not manipulate so much as recognize one of my adventurous stories and what the lesson. There's always many lessons, but what's the strongest lesson in this story of going down that mountain in Norway? And then, okay, then I can talk to Claire at Anik and go, this one fits perfect in react, or observe. And that's how I ended up playing with the stories. I've got so many more stories. I've already sent them a whole list. I've said, here's another 30 stories I have. And if you're interested, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, in part 2.
That's one of the things I really loved about the book in reading it, was the format of it being aimed at children allowed the core story the core lesson of the story to sort of shine through in a way that maybe if you're into bushcraft and stuff, you can kind of get into the nitty gritty about like the details of the survival, but the stories you're telling have a really clear through line, and I think that's pretty cool even for adult readers, reading this to their kids.
Well, thank you for that. And yes, and I think that happened organically, and I'm thrilled with it because I didn't want to get back into, okay, here's how you do the fire bow. I've already done that. B, the way I've done it many, many times is perfectly appropriate for kids to get into and watch on YouTube or what have you. So this, you're right, the through line organically happened, and it kind of was maybe indicative of working with kids. I was able to sidestep all of the noogly details and the technical details and the technicalities and get to some really strong points. And let's face it, what's the point of the book? The point of the book is to get kids excited about nature. The point of everything I've ever done in my life is to get people excited about nature, to connect them to nature. That's it. That's the underlying subtext to Survivorman and Shark Week and Bigfoot and everything I do. So now, that said, we also had the opportunity to say, but let's give them something here. So that's why every chapter we added on the, and here's what you can do at home, or try this, sort of thing.
There's a subtext with what you just said about your motivation is to get people excited about nature. I want to talk about why. Why is that so important, especially today?
Okay. Your tag ending there is what I was just about to answer one way, but I think I see where you're going. But first, I will answer a little more philosophically and say it's really difficult for me to answer the why question about anything I do. Why are you passionate about nature? I don't even know. It's like, I don't know. How do you ask a musician why are they passionate about playing the piano? I'm sure many of them will just say, I don't know. Ever since I was 5 years old, I was just in love with the piano, and that's the way it's been for me in nature. Ever since I was 5 years old, it's just a magnet. And I am steel in that case. I just sucked right over to it. I'm looking out the window right now at pine tree and just even that vision, just like, oh yeah. And I don't know, am I a geek? I suppose, but I love it. But why today and why now? Well, part of me wants to say, look, it's always been the same importance. I don't know that an era of time creates more importance than has ever been for people to connect to nature. Maybe recognizing the importance of it is stronger now than ever. I think, unfortunately, if I can speak a little broader, I think, unfortunately, ever since the industrial age, we've been doing ourselves in a pretty efficient manner. So I think potentially the need has been, ever since the dawn of the industrial age, has been the need to start thinking about, okay, that's great that over there in your Charles Dickens type factory, but we still need to get those people back out into nature at the same time. So now we have all the plethora of, forest bathing that we learn about and time in nature. I think that science is showing the healing aspects of being out in nature. We're physically stronger. It's so much easier for us to deal with stress when we get time in nature. There's scientific studies that show that even hospital patients who can see a tree out their window, just see it, heal better and require less painkiller than hospital patients in rooms that don't have windows. So we know where that's all going on, and science is helping us explain it. I think, again, not to cop out, but I think the need has always been the same for us. But that said, if we're going to go down that road a little bit, yeah, the level of distraction we have with technology, and I'm not anti-technology. I'm speaking to you with expensive headphones on my head and an expensive computer, and we're doing this online. In fact, I think a lot of times technology can facilitate natural experiences. For example, I'm a search and rescue technician. I think everybody should have a GPS and some way of connecting to the outside world. If I go on a big trip, I still take a satellite phone. So I'm not anti-technology, but I'm not a gamer. I'll say that. My son was. I used to play Call of Duty with him because it's my son and I'm his father.
Yeah, right.
But at the same token, it's like, yeah, but now we need to go hike Algonquin Park. So I know I haven't really asked why, because why is a difficult question. Because to me, the why, I live and breathe the why. I just like, why wouldn't you?
Right.
It's humanly so necessary to connect to the real world, the natural real world. So, and we are bombarded. Now I'm speaking old news. We all know we've been bombarded with distractions for years. So.
I'm wondering, in your work as a filmmaker and now a writer and all the things you do, what you consider your artistic vision to be.
Personally speaking, I would love it if they put on my gravestone, he was a prolific artist. So personally speaking, the mission is to be prolific, to constantly create, to constantly release creations of all sorts. The artistic mission has several levels, but one is absolutely to connect people to nature. You can see it in all of my work. My music, my writing, my speaking, my performing. When I perform, I have big screens with nature scenes, and of course my film work. So connecting people to nature, absolutely. But in addition to that, if I step outside of that in any way, it's always to inspire. It's always to, let me put it this way. Every single Survivorman shoot I ever did started out with me sitting beside a river or a rock or a lake or in the desert and invoking into the universe, if you will, in any way, shape, or form you think suits your spiritual realities. I would say, whatever I'm about to do, let it be inspiring and let it bring about a positive influence in people's lives. So I suppose that is my artistic mission, including the music I write or the books I write.
And just a personal follow-up question, because I'm an artist and I'm interested in how these things work in people's minds, but do you find that being a multi-hyphenate, like you're a filmmaker and a writer and a musician, do you find that makes it easier to, like when you get stuck with one thing, you can go do something else for a while and that kind of helps your process?
I'll try not to be too verbose because it's a favorite subject of mine you just asked about. My answer lies within my personality. I'm a multitasker. I like, yes. The short answer is yes. It absolutely works for me that I can bounce around. Do I get myself in trouble that way? Yeah, I do. Taking on more than I should, having too many to-do lists. That can happen. But the reason why it's a favorite subject of mine is because people will, and I'm not a motivational speaker or teacher in any way, shape, or form, but when people go down that road, I had to go down that road because I had no mentorship or guidance growing up. So I had to do self-help books and self-help videos and things like that for me. And so much of that is manifested by type A personalities who say, be singularly focused and start a journal and write in the journal every morning. You know what? None of that works for me. I'm not ADD necessarily, but I'm certainly not singularly focused. You know what? I'm almost 60. I know that I'm never going to be singularly focused, no matter what I tell myself, no matter how many books I read. And I think that's why I'm glad you asked, because I like to say this, and I hope anybody listening can give themselves license to go, yeah, oh, you mean it's okay to want to do 7 things at the same time? Barring the fact that don't get yourself in trouble. I do get myself in trouble. No question about it. Right. But it's fun, because the variety in that is at any given time, I can either be perfectly at home in a dugout canoe in the middle of the Amazon jungle or blowing harmonica on a stage in Las Vegas with Slash. And everything in between, going to the Broadway in New York with my wife dressed up in a or wearing grubby, dirty clothes in a canoe in Canada, hiking a mountain. And I love that variety. That juxtaposition to me is my spice for life. So if you're singularly focused, man, good on you. You're probably going to be, top of your game. Your 10,000 hours will be 20,000 hours. But I try to put, 5,000 hours into several things. And you know what? I'm almost 60, and I can't say it's failed me. It's working for me.
That's a great perspective. Backpacking Light has, our core purpose in the beginning was to help people carry less into the backcountry, because a heavy pack was such a barrier for so many people, including kids and people with disabilities and senior citizens and families. And our purpose is continuing to evolve. And today it's really focused on helping people overcome the barriers that prevent them from incorporating nature into their day-to-day living. What do you see as the primary barriers that prevent children from connecting to nature today?
Their parents.
As a scout leader, I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
To the hill. Yeah.
So it was a nice story. I was asked by a woman once at a keynote that I'd given. She said, how can I get my 3-year-old daughter interested in nature? And I said, do you have a backyard? And she said, yes. I said, is it like grass and maybe some shrubbery? She said, yes. I said, then, obviously supervised, allow your daughter to go out in the backyard and get dirt up her fingernails. Allow her to sit in the mud and the dirt and play with a stick. Allow her to pull a worm halfway out of the ground and it breaks off and it makes her cry. Allow her to experience those things. And the woman was grateful, but I could also see, I did reach her, I could see in her eyes, but she did have to process this perspective because we live in such a society focused on sanitization. And I'm not big on sanitization. Now, notwithstanding the pandemic and notwithstanding real health issues, I'm not cavalier. But I also, somebody once said about, they were talking about getting dirty on camping trips. And finally it fell on, the guy was making a funny commentary and he goes, oh, and Les? Yeah, I think Les just lives to be dirty. You know, because he's talking about how everybody's dealing with being clean on a camping trip. And that's what his comment on me was. Now, it's you know, I notwithstanding health realities, but I think the barriers are parents and their desire to sanitize and seek not inappropriate, but overwrought safety measures. You know, skinning our knees. Look, I don't want anyone to be hurt, and I don't want anyone to break a bone, and I don't want any tragedies of those sorts. But goodness gracious, you have to cross the street at some time. At some point in your life. And so rather than protecting and helicopter parenting our kids. So yeah, I mean, really, that's I don't want to get too verbose on this, but that's the biggest barrier that I've ever experienced is their own parents. And are there other barriers? Just to add an addendum onto this, funnily enough, kids don't seem to have a lot of barriers until their parents give them to them. Kids aren't afraid of spiders until they see their mom's terrified of them. Kids aren't afraid of certain things until they see their dad is really nervous of it. But when they're young, they're ready, man. So, you know, my kids grew up with handfuls of leeches in their hands because I knew the leeches couldn't hurt them. So I suppose I would add to the parental thing, as a parent, get knowledge. Truly understand what's going on in nature. Don't make assumptions.
Why do you think parents have evolved, at least in civilized first world countries, to protect their children from uncertainty and discomfort?
I'll reach a little broader in this. Media. You know, it seems to me from your line of questioning, you guys seek to get to the core of connecting to nature and connecting to nature on a really interesting trajectory, by the way, the lightest way possible, making it accessible. Quick tangent. I used to have, as a purist for a while there, I used to think certain places should be out of touch from all human beings. I changed my perspective on that entirely. I think that if a place is not accessed by people on hiking trails and what have you, nobody's going to love it, nobody's going to save it. So I changed my mind on that. You know, a few hundred people walking through a remote area over the course of a year is not going to change the ecosystem. Sure. So and if we stopped, it would reclaim it really quickly. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here because I tangent too much because your questions are so good. But where were we again on that one?
I'm asking why, as parents, we're trending towards protecting our children from uncertainty and discomfort.
And I had answered media. And when I say that, here's you know, my pet peeve. For example, I had to go on recently in Texas to talk about the big the disaster they had, the blackout, the freeze out, all of that. And when they asked me to do it, CBS, and when they asked me, I said, ask them how long I'll be on because I'm not coming on and doing a 60-minute soundbite. You want me on to talk about something, you know, media people, then have me on to speak about something. Don't have me on. Sure. I'm not going to give you a soundbite with some, you know, simple little trick somebody can do, you know, because they're cold. And right. Media trends towards the soundbite and the short, quick solution. But on top of that, now I'll bring it home here. On top of that is that if you watch a lot of media personnel, if you will, anchor men, anchor women, they live in a world that's very sanitized. They're dressed sharply. Most of them are probably not outdoorsy type people. So when they report on a mass media forum about some situation, they always, especially local media, they always have to make that horrifyingly cheesy pun joke thing at the end of their thing about how you'll never catch me dead out in the woods. Huh. You know, they always do that, but over and over and over again they do this. And a lot of times I'm swearing at the TV screen when somebody does that, because I think you just turned people off of hang gliding because of your comment. You just turned people off of rock climbing or canoeing because of your stupid ass little comment, because you know nothing about it, because you're a TV anchor person who lives in the heart of Chicago or Toronto, who doesn't get outside, and their husband, you know, your husband is an accountant, or your wife is, you know, is whatever. And yes, I'm being critical here, but it's because I've seen it over and over again. So that media, that ambiance of media is really prevalent now. And the quotation of wrong statistics and the spin of statistics and the joking about how you'll never catch me dead out there, you know, or it's as I hate, because you know, there's a lot of beauty. Well, I can go on forever on that, but there's a lot of beauty about the adventure, the outdoor adventurous lifestyle. And yes, people break legs when they slip, and yes, people die in a rock climbing accident, but a lot more die getting hit by a car in the middle of a city. So I think it's that. I think that is a big part of that, because I'll bring it home this way, because parents who are watching this stuff, and then they're it's feeding them, and then they just repeat it. You know, the soccer moms and the soccer dads of this world. I mean, God bless people who are focused on community and being soccer dads and being soccer moms. I'm being very generic here, but by the same token, when I call it the soccer mom phenomenon came about in the mid 80s, I was horrified. When you know, I remember seeing parents would look at me with my toddlers and, you know, upset that I'm letting my son climb up a rock that happens to be 2 feet high. Oh, whoa, you better get over your whoa. And I get that from, you know, my father-in-law or something like that. I get that. And so and that's, again, I think it's perpetrated by media, and then it's perpetrated by fearful people. Yeah, obviously you got me going on that one.
Yeah, no, I can resonate with that. As a parent, I've had debates with other parents on the same subject, and what inevitably comes up is that they aren't willing to take the risk for allowing their kids to have unsanitized experiences in the outdoors because the rewards to them are not high enough. But I argue back that the risks of not exposing your kids to the outdoors are much higher.
Well, and I would say, here's a really fine example of this situation. I don't know where you gentlemen are geographically, but if you're in a cold place ever, and it's cold, it's wintertime, your 5-year-old wants to go outside. 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old. What does every parent do? Whoa, get back over here, little Billy, little Nancy, little Fiona, whatever your name is. Let me get those mitts on you. You're not going out the door without your mitts on. I let my kids go out all the time that way. Minus 20 degrees. Yeah, go ahead, Logan. I don't want to wear my mitts. Go ahead. Within 30 seconds, he's back in and he's discovered he needs to wear mitts. But what we don't, we nip that off at the bud, and we say, no, you have to put your mitts on. And so again, that's another form of protection. It's like, they're not going to get frostbite on their fingers.
Right.
It's not going to happen. They're kids. They're going to feel a pain. They're going to come in crying, and they're going to ask for their mitts. That's real simple. And that's one of my examples.
Kids have a tremendous ability to self-regulate themselves, and we tend to step in and regulate too much for them.
I agree. That's exactly right. We have to trust. Kids want to feel trusted. You know, I'll tell you, as a parent, I am a parent. I have a 24-year-old, a 25-year-old, and 23-year-old now. I never lied to them. Now, did I carve things for age appropriateness? Of course I did. But I've never lied. They ask me a question, they get the truth. You know? And I mean, when they're 17, hey, Dad, did you ever smoke pot? I'm going to answer them honestly. Hey, Dad, did you ever do hard drugs? I'm going to answer them honestly. I'm not going to say, no, don't do that. And then one day we're looking at a photo album from high school. It's like, Dad, is that a joint in your right? So, and I'm not suggesting that's my story at all for any listeners right now. As an example, I'm just saying that you don't lie to your kids. And lying to your kids by telling them you're going to freeze your fingers off, it's like, you should wear your mitts. I don't wanna. Okay, fine.
They'll come around, they'll figure it out later, and they'll either respect you or not respect you for what you taught them.
Exactly. And you have to respect your children. You have to let them respect you, and telling them the truth and enabling them, allowing them to enable themselves to have the kind of life they want is, I think, what we're here for.
So I was going to ask a question about how parents or guardians can help children overcome fears or hesitancy in the outdoors, but I think I'm going to change it now based on what we just talked about to say, how can we as adults, how can we be better at implementing everything we just talked about?
Education. So I have beside me, we have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. Adorable girls. We love them to death. They come over and hang out with us, and I've got a big field where I am right now. So I'm in both Southern Oregon, and also I'm up in Canada. But in Southern Oregon, we have this field, and I've put out 27 bird feeders, 15 bird houses. I built by hand 2 little tiny frog ponds that right now are filled with hundreds of frogs, soon to be hundreds of tadpoles. It's the educational part. When those 2 girls come over, and I'm not even their parent, but when those 2 girls come over, I love breaking the ice between their knowledge and the natural knowledge that I know. Now, okay, I'm that guy, I've learned a lot of this stuff, but it's really easy stuff to learn, and it's fun. So the more a parent engages with with your nature as a parent in the backyard, you discover that, well, like my new show called Wild Harvest, which is all about local foraging. Let's say they can walk down the street a bit, or even in their own gully in their yard. And I understand some people live in apartment buildings and condos and so on, but there are ravines, there are parks, there are places you can go. In Manhattan, you can go to Central Park. So you go and you learn what's there. And even where I live up in Canada, I've taught people on my road, they look at the edge of our gravel pit as a wasteland. And I said, are you kidding? This is one of the best patches of milkweed I've ever seen. We are we are fostering monarch butterfly, population growth by don't park the road grader there. And so in the discussions, because I know this, right? So if parents learn these things about what's around them naturally, they can then impart that to the 5-year-old and 7-year-old who doesn't know. So when these 2 little girls come over, and by the way, the last time they came over, I've got this. It's about a 15 by 15 foot, 2 foot deep pond of mud, and that I'm still trying to get cattail to grow in. And that's my frog pond. So when they come over, they start up, going in with the boots. Within 10 minutes, they're sitting in the water in the muck. I happen to know that their father welcomes that with me. He has no issues with it. So there I am allowing my neighbor's kids to get dirt up their fingernails and learn. And then when we, I remember teaching the little girl about, understand that if you're going to constantly try picking up the salamanders and picking up the frogs, that you're rubbing their natural, liquids off of their body, and it might hurt them later. So it's better to watch them and come over here and look at this. Do you see this tadpole? So that's really it. It's, you're a parent. Engage with your child. And if it's something you don't know anything about, then seek out people like me. So my neighbor, he loves that I do that with his kids. When my son was young, he was interested in electronics. Don't come to me for that, but his Uncle Glenn was phenomenal at that. His Uncle Bill loves rebuilding cars. My son would hang with Uncle Bill to rebuild cars. So for nature, find a geek neighbor like Les Stroud. And if it's not your thing, and get little bits of that knowledge and then impart it onto the kids.
Your story of salamanders is really heartwarming to me because I have a similar one. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I would spend time with my grandparents in Olympia, Washington, and they were always willing to let me go play in the back 40 or get my hands dirty or whatever. And they used to take me to this place called Black Lake, and there was a marshy swamp there. And in the swamp were newts, and they would allow me to capture newts and take them home and raise them and have them as pets. And it is at that young age, it was my earliest memory of nature, and it absolutely still has a profound impact on my memories of my grandparents and my relationship with them, and it's my first remembered connection to nature, and it's profound.
It absolutely is. Mine was toads, and believe it or not, ants.
Yeah.
I was really big on ants. I used to have a dozen peanut butter jars that were emptied out, filled with dirt. I'd put butter around the lip of the peanut butter jar so the ants couldn't climb out, and then I would individually capture ants. Of course, then I got a little silly because every once in a while I'd put some red ants and some black ants together in a big and I'd watch the war. But anyway,
Right.
That was a little, but I was guiding myself in those situations, didn't know any better, but it truly is. And that, again, the focus on the book Wild Outside, one of the things I did not want to do was to mislead children into thinking they needed to go to the mountains of Peru to have an adventure. I wanted them to
Right.
understood that their adventure is right in their backyard. And if they don't have a backyard, it's down the street in the park or the ravine. And that's why I start off by saying when I was young, but not when I was younger, so I'm talking like 20s, early 20s, I would go and walk my dogs in the ravine behind the hospital underneath a highway in downtown Toronto. But that ravine had blue herons and deer and fox and the most northern remnant of the Carolinian forest. So adventure for kids, it's a horrible cliche, I suppose, but it truly is right outside their door.
When you aren't out in the woods as a filmmaker or an author, what types of wilderness experiences are the most satisfying to you?
I can answer in one word and say canoeing. I suppose it would be, and I alluded to this earlier, sharing it with someone. Mm-hmm. I'm not a loner, and despite what my reputation and my whole career is. I love sharing it with someone. So that's it there. It's, every time I've looked at an amazing, incredible, breathtaking, jaw-dropping view by myself, I always felt sad because I wish there was someone I could go, oh, look at that. That's all, just to say that one line, oh, look at that. But to be able to say that to somebody, so that's it for me, is we hike intensely, and I've probably seen more hiking trails than a lot of people who grew up in Oregon because it's our thing, right? So we hike intensely, and then up in Canada canoeing. But to answer your question, it's to share it with someone, at least one person.
Les, as we transition to our final question, what final message do you want to leave our listeners with?
That's a tough question. I think it would be to try to understand that we are from nature, we are of nature. Regardless of your spiritual beliefs, you could be full-on Buddhist, heavy practicing Catholic, or an atheist. One way or the other, we are flesh and blood, and we are natural things. And out there, out that window, is also all natural. Now, yes, even this computer came from nature, if you really want to get down to it. Mm-hmm. But alive, living, breathing nature is not this computer. Alive, living, breathing nature is right outside that window. And I can promise you that if you allow it to connect to you and you connect to it by just sitting in it, big fan of ropes courses, big fan of adventure, but those things require wilderness as a backdrop for an activity. That's different from just being in nature, being with nature. And I promise you that if you could just get some time, even if it's just once a week, but I would hope it's once a day, to just sit in at nature, even if it's a park, I promise you, you end up feeling better within 20 minutes. That's, you're not supposed to make guarantees like that, but I would make a guarantee. Within 20 minutes of sitting in nature, you will some way, somehow feel at least slightly better, no matter what your particular situation might be at the moment.
Les, you've left a powerful and important legacy, and this next chapter, when you're trying to motivate and reach out to children and their parents, is going to amplify that more than I think we'll ever know. Thank you so much for talking with us on the podcast today.
It's been my pleasure. Your line of questioning's been refreshing, and you didn't ask about Bigfoot, so kudos to you. Thank you.
I grew up in Montana and lived there for 20 years, so we know all about Bigfoot.
So a time for a conversation on another time.
That's right. Thanks again, Les. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much, guys.
All right, Andrew, that was a super cool interview. What struck you the most about it?
Well, I think I've mentioned this before, but my wife is an educator, and she's a Montessori educator. And I was really struck by the parallels between that pedagogy, which is all around natural consequences and letting children explore and innovate with freedom, but within a structure of safety. And I was really struck by how Les, through his career as an educator, as an outdoor educator, has kind of come to an educational philosophy that strikes me as very similar to that pedagogy.
Experiential education, where you can put someone into an environment and let the environment guide the teaching, is so incredibly powerful. I've experienced this because I've been involved in experiential education as a student and as an educator, a scout leader, and just it's such a fundamental part of human transformation and curiosity and discovery. And it's wonderful to see someone like Les, who has been in the limelight so much and has intentionally brought this into every fabric of his life and the rest of his relationships.
Mm-hmm. And also just letting people fail, not just children, but letting people fail and learn from that failure, which I know is an element of experiential education, but I think it's worth highlighting, especially because the content of his book is structured around, mistakes he made and what he learned from them, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, what stuck out to you?
Two things. The first one is that Les acknowledged that he used to be a fan of preserving untouched wilderness untouched wilderness that should never be impacted by humans. And then he noted that he has changed his course on that because he sees the value in nature's ability to take people, relationships, even transferring that to the broader social fabric of our culture as beneficial to people. And to me, that is incredibly powerful. And so that is the thing I've always thought about as well. I love being in wilderness, remote wilderness. I love doing it alone because I'm introverted and I appreciate that. But I get a lot more satisfaction about seeing other people grow as a result of their experience in nature.
Yeah. I think that touches on something that I think about a lot, which is that as outdoor enthusiasts, we tend to get grumpy when there are a lot of people in the places that we consider our places.
Right. Yeah,
and it's especially noticeable, I think, this year. I was just reading an article that the national parks saw record numbers of traffic this year. And I always just try to remind myself when I'm in those situations and I get frustrated that the more people who are experiencing those places and falling in love with them, the more they will be engaged and committed to preserving those places.
Absolutely. And, since moving down to Laramie, I've experienced more crowds because Colorado is, the Rockies down here tend to be more crowded because of their proximity to Denver. And I've been going to the California Sierra for several years. And 2 years ago was certainly the most crowded I've ever seen it in the place where we were hiking and camping. But at the end of the day, even in an area that is one of the most popular lakes in the Sierras, there was probably 8 parties camped around this relatively small lake basin. But at the end of the day, when everybody's back at their campsites and I had my own little cubby in the woods where I set up my tent, at the end of the day, I could go back to that and it was as if there was nobody around. So there there is some perspective. There's a difference between seeing lots of people near a trailhead, day hiking on trails, and then being in a remote spot, even when it's occupied by a bunch of other people, and being in a quiet corner of the woods and finding some solitude. And there's still magic out there.
I want to just touch on one thing that Les said about education. And I think this is really key because there's never been more information widely available to us than there is right now. But a lot of it's bad or wrong.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if you had any insight on how to follow Les's advice of educating yourself. If you had any insight on maybe some trustworthy sources or the best way to go about starting that journey of self-education in terms of outdoor skills.
At the core, I'm not the ideal person to do this because I'm a research geek. And so the first place I always go is to like scientific journals. And I read a variety of journals, everything from engineering to social research to, the Journal of Outdoor Education. And so those are my primary sources of information because I like to see what people are doing at the cutting edge of research. In terms of news and things like that and learning education, pedagogy, and philosophies from mass media, it's really difficult for me to trust anything. So I have to look at organizations that are actually developing this kind of stuff. And so for me, it's a huge challenge because I'm inherently distrustful of almost any media. And I really like to go back to the source of people who are doing primary research.
Mm.
And that's challenging because it's hard for lay people to find that and discern what is good, solid, objective primary research and what is being promoted in the media as messages.
Right. I mean, I even think about, there's this idea of content marketing. So it's like a company that's like selling stoves will also have a blog that will say like 5 ways to stay warm this winter,
Right.
And I mean, is any of that trustworthy or no?
It's difficult because many of these companies will outsource their content marketing to a marketing agency or a public relations agency or a writing agency or their ambassadors or there's a whole bunch of different people that can do content marketing, and often the content marketers are disconnected from the people who are actually designing the gear under the hood to solve problems. So as long as we acknowledge that and recognize it and see that there may be a disconnect, the content marketing may or may not actually reflect the quality of the product. So I look at a company like MSR, and they've been making gear long before and designing gear long before they ever had a blog. Now they have a blog. It is, I find it inspiring and useful and valuable, and it's not spammy or anything like that. So, as you read more and more of this stuff, you start to see the difference between a company who is just trying to promote their products and a company that's actually trying to inspire and educate their readers. And I think MSR does a good job of that. But then looking at that company under the hood, you can see that they employ some of the best product designers, engineers in the world to like create reliable products from scratch for extreme conditions. And so many outdoor gear companies today are even outsourcing their design, their manufacturing, to the point where we have this culture of outdoor gear making, and it's most prevalent on places like Amazon, where you've got an outdoor gear brand that is basically finding an overseas company, finding a product and then slapping their brand on it and calling it their own gear. And that's really difficult to sort out. And it makes me, like I said before, it makes me kind of inherently distrustful of any new brand that comes out. And I want to know the product origin story. I want to know the designer who's behind it. And we get a lot of inquiries to have gear reviews from these types of brands. And inherently, I almost always say, no, we need to know that this is your product. And I mean, if you're just slapping a brand on it, us doing a gear review of it is not going to be super helpful to our readership.
Well, that's good advice. Well, let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about what's new at BPL, because we're still in a period of lots of exciting things happening right now.
Yeah, I just launched the new webinar on footwear and traction systems for snow travel. So that's being super well received. And the goal with that webinar was really to provide a good bite-sized bit of education. It's about 90 minutes long for hikers in all seasons who need to walk on snow at some point. And so, you can look at the winter season where, up here in the Rockies, snow is very deep, it's unconsolidated, it's soft, and skis and snowshoes are generally required unless you're hiking on a packed trail. And then you've got spring conditions. People are going to start thinking about spring. It's right around the corner, and the snowpack is going to consolidate a little more and motivate people to get out hiking. And as that transitions into summer, you've got remnant snow in the high country, you've got snow across high passes, and, through hikers coming up the PCT into the Sierra are going to be facing some pretty hairy pass crossings this year. And so they've got their own needs for safely crossing those passes. And that's what we're trying to tackle in the webinar. How do you design a footwear and traction system that keeps you safe and comfortable on the variety of terrain that we could encounter as backpackers?
Super good resource, and we'll definitely put a link to that webinar in the show notes. As far as what's going on in the forums, one thing that stuck out to me this week was one of our columnists, Mark Wetherington, wrote a book review of a book called Billionaire Wilderness. And the scope of this book is fairly narrow. It takes a look at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And Mark's pretty clear about that. But the conversation in the forum has expanded to encompass the larger topic of housing in mountain towns. And I found this very interesting and personal because my wife and I live in the Tahoe Basin. It's a huge ski town, and she's a teacher, and I've been doing some version of what we're doing right now for the last few years. And in the 3 years we've been here, we've seen a studio apartment, almost double in price. It's a good discussion, and it's one without any easy answers, which I think is what we're seeing happen in the forum right now.
I am in the middle of the book right now. I was so drawn to this topic, spending a couple of decades in Bozeman, Montana, and watching its housing soar to levels that just are not commensurate with the actual value of a house there. It has been pretty remarkable to watch. And then, we're in the process of, Laramie's kind of a transition town for us. And so we're trying to figure out what's next. And just housing is a really challenging thing. And so some of the premises that the book discusses and tackles are that ultra wealthy interests and places or organizations like land trusts have contributed to the housing crisis in some of these places because they're locking up land that cannot be developed for housing. Now, it's done with an altruistic motivation because conservation is a good thing, right? Not developing land is a good thing, right? But you do that in a place like Jackson, which is surrounded on all four sides by mountains that you cannot build on because they're public lands. And all of a sudden, you have ultra wealthy interests snapping up all the land. But where do the people live who work in Jackson and provide all the services? They're living in Idaho across Teton Pass, or they're sharing a house with 4 families, or they're sleeping in their van. I mean, it's crazy there. And the reason the book tackles Jackson is because it is the nation's most expensive real estate market. And it's in a stunningly beautiful place. I've spent a ton of time in Jackson. 2 decades ago, I used to want to live there. But oh man, it is a really challenging and complex and difficult thing to address, because we all want to grab onto the idea that land conservation is a good thing, but it has dramatic impacts on working class society.
We'll put a link to the book in the show notes. It's definitely worth a read, and it really does take a book length dive into the topic in order to grasp all the nuances. So.
It does, and I encourage everybody to read it and just read it with an open mind. And it has given me empathy for a wider swath of society than I had before.
Well, that's going to do it for the Backpacking Light podcast. Ryan, thanks for chatting today. It was a pleasure as always.
Yes, definitely. It was a good show, and great to talk to Les about some deep topics.
The Backpacking Light podcast is advertising free thanks to the membership fees paid for by Backpacking Light members. A backpackinglight.com membership gives you access to 20 years of archives, forums, and online resources. So please consider supporting this podcast and become a member right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe.
You can download the show notes for this episode at backpackinglight.com/podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review. It helps other people find the show.
Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the car.